On a frozen morning in late December, a small girl in tattered clothes approached the terrace of La Belle Époque café, her voice barely rising above the chatter of wealthy patrons sipping their espresso. "Can I sing for a bite of bread?" she asked, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. They dismissed her with waves of their manicured hands, some laughing at the audacity of such a ragged child disturbing their breakfast. They did not know she was Clara Whitmore, the child opera prodigy who had vanished from the world's greatest stages 2 years earlier, now singing on street corners to keep her dying mother alive. One man, the cafe owner Thomas Bennett, saw something in her eyes that the others missed. That single moment of recognition would change everything. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. Dawn crept through the cracked window of the tiny apartment like an unwelcome guest, casting pale gray light across bare walls that had once held family photographs and framed concert posters. Clara Whitmore opened her eyes to the sound she dreaded most. Her mother's weak coughing echoing from the adjacent room, each rasp a reminder of how far they had fallen. She was 10 years old, but her eyes carried the weight of someone who had lived a dozen lifetimes. The single threadbare blanket they shared had slipped during the night, and Clara pulled it gently back over her small frame, her breath visible in the cold air that seeped through every crack in their world. The cupboards stood empty, their hollow interiors mocking her with memories of abundance. She rose silently, her bare feet touching the frigid floor, and moved to the doorway where her mother lay sleeping fitfully. Margaret's face, once radiant and full of life, had become gaunt and pale, shadows pooling beneath her closed eyes. Clara watched the shallow rise and fall of her mother's chest, counting each breath like precious coins. In the quiet of that frozen morning, fragments of another life flickered through her mind like scenes from a half-remembered dream. Concert halls bathed in golden light, the weight of velvet curtains against her small hands, thunderous applause that felt like love made audible. Her father's proud smile from the wings, his eyes glistening with tears of joy. That life seemed impossibly distant now, separated from this moment by an chasm of grief and loss. Clara, dressed in her threadbare coat, the hem frayed and the buttons mismatched, patches sewn by her mother's trembling hands covering holes that spoke of 2 hard winters survived. She studied her reflection in the cracked mirror by the door, seeing a ghost of the girl who once wore silk dresses and stood in spotlights. But beneath the poverty, beneath the worn fabric and tangled hair, something remained unbroken. Her posture straightened instinctively, muscle memory from years of training her body to channel sound into beauty. She checked her mother one final time, adjusting the blanket with tender care, then stepped into the frozen streets with quiet resolve, determined to bring home something, anything, to ease the hunger that gnawed at them both. The city transformed as Clara walked, poverty giving way to prosperity with each block she traversed. The affluent district gleamed in the morning light, storefronts displaying treasures behind crystalline windows that reflected a world she no longer belonged to. Designer boutiques showcased mannequins draped in coats that cost more than a year's rent in her cramped apartment. Jewelers arranged diamonds that caught the weak winter sun and transformed it into rainbows. Restaurants prepared for the day's service, their interiors warm and inviting, the scent of fresh bread and coffee drifting onto the sidewalk like a cruel taunt. Clara pulled her tattered coat tighter, aware of how she appeared against this backdrop of abundance. People hurried past without seeing her, their eyes sliding over her as though she were invisible. Just another piece of urban debris to be stepped around and forgotten. She had learned to move through their world like a ghost, present but unacknowledged. The Augustan concert hall rose before her like a cathedral of memory, its grand facade unchanged, its marquee announcing performances by artists whose names she once knew, whose dressing rooms she had visited with her father. Clara stopped, unable to move, her feet rooted to the sidewalk as 2 years of grief crashed over her like a wave. She had sung on that stage, standing ovations, critics calling her a once-in-a-generation talent. Her father beaming from the front row. That was before the accident. before the rain-slicked highway and the truck that crossed the median, before the hospital where her father took his final breath while holding her hand. Margaret had collapsed at the funeral, her grief manifesting as physical illness that never fully released its grip. The medical bills arrived like an avalanche, burying them beneath debt they could never escape. Insurance covered some, but not enough. Never enough. Their savings evaporated. The performance contracts Clara held were cancelled, the prestigious vocal academy refunding tuition to a family in crisis. They sold everything. The beautiful apartment replaced by the cramped room where they now barely survived. Clara had tried singing at various locations throughout the city, street corners and subway platforms, her voice echoing in spaces that had no memory of her former glory. But people rarely listened to a shabby child. They assumed she was playing pretend, a beggar's trick, not recognizing that the impossible beauty coming from her small frame was real and trained and born from years of sacrifice. Her mother's fierce pride prevented them from seeking charity, from asking the opera company or former colleagues for help. Margaret would rather starve than beg. So Clara begged for them both, disguising necessity as performance, her dignity wrapped around her like armor. She turned away from the concert hall and continued walking, determination burning in her chest like a small flame that refused to die. La Belle Époque occupied the corner of Fifth and Hastings like a jewel box, all gleaming glass and polished brass. Its outdoor terrace, somehow civilized despite the December cold. Wealthy patrons sat bundled in expensive furs and cashmere, heat lamps glowing above their heads like miniature suns, their tables laden with pastries and steaming cups that cost more than Clara had seen in weeks. She stood across the street, hidden in the shadow of a bookshop awning, watching them laugh and gesture with hands adorned in leather gloves, soft as butter. They looked so comfortable, so insulated from the cold that bit at her exposed skin, existing in a bubble of warmth and plenty that seemed as distant as the moon. Clara's stomach cramped with hunger. She had eaten nothing yesterday, saving the stale bread for her mother. Gathering courage felt like trying to lift something impossibly heavy, but necessity pushed her forward. One foot, then another. She crossed the street, her worn shoes making no sound, and approached the terrace's edge where a middle-aged man stood in the doorway observing his domain. Thomas Bennet had kind eyes, she noticed, though his face carried the lines of someone acquainted with sorrow. He watched the morning unfold with the attention of someone who saw more than surfaces. Clara moved past him toward the nearest table, where a woman in mink sat beside a man reading a financial newspaper. Her voice emerged small but clear. "Excuse me, can I sing for a bite of bread?" The woman's face twisted as though Clara had offered her something rotten. "A beggar," she announced to her companion with disgust. "They're everywhere now." The man lowered his paper, his eyes cold and assessing. "You need to leave before you disturb our meal," he said, his tone suggesting she was something to be disposed of, not a child asking for help. Clara tried again, addressing the table beyond them. "Please, I can sing for you. I only need something small." A businessman waved her away without looking up from his phone. "Security," someone called, their voice sharp with annoyance. Another woman clutched her purse tighter as though Clara might snatch it, her expression a mixture of fear and contempt. The rejection landed like blows. Each dismissive gesture another confirmation that she was invisible, worthless, beneath their notice. But Clara stood her ground, her small frame somehow containing an ocean of dignity that refused to break. A well-dressed couple at the corner table exchanged glances laden with mockery, their perfectly coiffed heads tilting toward each other in conspiratorial amusement. The woman whispered loudly enough for Clara to hear, her diamond earrings catching the light as she gestured with a manicured hand. "Does she think she's going to an audition for Les Miserables?" Her companion laughed, a sharp bark of sound that cut through the morning air. "Perhaps she's method acting," he added, and they both dissolved into laughter that felt like acid on Clara's skin. A businessman in a charcoal suit stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the pavement. "I'm calling the police," he announced, pulling out his phone with theatrical disgust. "We pay good money to eat here without being accosted by street urchins." Clara's hands trembled at her sides, clutching nothing but cold air, but her voice remained steady. "I'm not begging for charity," she said quietly, her words carrying a weight that seemed too large for such a small frame. "I only want to earn food through my voice. I can sing for you. That's all I'm asking." The contrast between them could not have been starker. Her threadbare coat with its mismatched buttons and frayed hem standing against their designer wool and Italian leather, her worn shoes beside their polished boots, her empty hands against their laden tables. She was a study in absence while they overflowed with excess, yet somehow she carried herself with a dignity they could not diminish, a quiet grace that came from somewhere deeper than circumstance. More voices joined the chorus of rejection. "Move along. You're disturbing everyone. Someone get the manager." Thomas Bennett remained in the doorway, watching, and something stirred in the depths of his memory. Like a fish moving beneath dark water, he had seen this child before, or someone like her, in another context where she had not been draped in poverty. The way she held herself, the pride in her bearing despite the humiliation, the careful articulation of her words, all spoke of training, of discipline, of a life that had known better days. Clara's eyes filled with tears that caught the morning light and transformed it into prisms, but she refused to let them fall. She blinked rapidly, swallowed hard, and maintained her composure even as she turned slowly to leave, her small back straight, her head held high, defeated but unbroken. "Wait." The word cut through the morning air like a bell, clear and commanding. Thomas Bennett stepped forward from the doorway, his hand raised. Clara stopped, turning slowly, her eyes wide with uncertainty and desperate hope. He walked toward her with measured steps, his presence somehow changing the atmosphere of the terrace, the patrons falling silent as their host approached the child they had dismissed. Thomas knelt down to her eye level, his knees touching the cold pavement, making himself small so she would not have to crane her neck to meet his gaze. "What's your name, child?" he asked, his voice gentle, stripped of the harshness that had surrounded her moments before. "Clara," she whispered, the name barely audible. "Clara, I would like to offer you breakfast," Thomas said, gesturing toward the warm interior of his café. "No payment needed. Just come inside where it's warm." But Clara shook her head, something fierce and proud flashing in her eyes despite their wetness. "I don't want charity," she said, her voice stronger now, carrying the echo of her mother's stubborn dignity. "I want to earn it. I can sing. I have a voice. Please, just let me sing for the food." Thomas studied her face, seeing layers beneath the surface that others had missed. The way she stood, weight balanced, shoulders back despite the cold and hunger, the careful enunciation of her words, the insistence on earning rather than receiving. This was not desperation born of ignorance, but necessity wrapped in training. "Then sing for me," he said simply, rising to his feet. A patron scoffed loudly. "Thomas, surely you're not entertaining this nonsense." But Thomas turned, and something in his expression silenced the objection immediately. His café, his rules, his choice. He had built this place with his own hands after walking away from a different life, and he would decide who deserved dignity within its walls. He gestured toward a small space near the café entrance, sheltered from the wind, visible to all. "There," he said, "your stage." Clara hesitated, her eyes moving from Thomas to the skeptical faces surrounding her, then back to the man who had shown her the first kindness she had encountered all morning. Something passed between them. An unspoken understanding, a recognition that neither fully grasped yet. She nodded once, a small dip of her chin, and walked to the designated spot. Thomas watched her move, noting the deliberate placement of each step, the way she positioned herself with the instinct of someone who had stood before audiences before. Her hands, which had trembled moments ago, now hung loosely at her sides. Her breathing slowed and deepened. She closed her eyes, and Thomas felt his heart quicken. This was no ordinary street child. This was a performer preparing to perform. Clara closed her eyes, and the world fell away. The cold vanished. The mocking faces disappeared. The hunger, the fear, the weight of 2 years carrying her mother's survival on her small shoulders, all of it dissolved into silence. She centered herself, drawing breath deep into her diaphragm, the way Maestro Ferretti had taught her when she was 6 years old, when her father still lived and music was joy instead of necessity. Her chin lifted, her hands relaxed, and then she began to sing. Not a simple melody, not a children's tune that might have been expected from a ragged child on a street corner. She sang Puccini, the aria that spoke of a daughter's desperate love for her father, of pleading and hope, and the willingness to sacrifice everything. Her voice emerged pure and crystalline, shattering the morning air like light through a prism. The first note hung suspended, impossible in its perfection, and the café fell into absolute silence. Conversations died mid-sentence. Forks paused halfway to open mouths. The businessman who had threatened to call the police stood frozen, his phone forgotten in his hand. Passers-by stopped on the sidewalk, drawn by a sound that seemed to bend reality around itself. The technical perfection was undeniable. Each note placed with surgical precision, her breathing controlled and invisible, her vibrato warm and mature beyond her years. But it was more than technique, it was the emotional depth that made hardened faces soften, that brought moisture to eyes accustomed to cynicism. This small, ragged child was pouring an ocean of grief and love into every phrase. Her voice, carrying the weight of loss, transformed into something transcendent. She sang of her father, and everyone listening heard their own losses echoed back to them. Thomas Bennett's eyes widened as recognition crashed over him like a wave. He knew this voice. He had heard it before, years ago, in a concert hall where he sat beside his wife in her final months, where they had wept together, listening to a child prodigy whose name had been whispered with reverence in musical circles. Clara Whitmore, the girl who had vanished, the talent that had been mourned as lost. She stood before him now in rags, singing for bread, and the beauty she created was somehow even more powerful for the suffering that had shaped it. The aria built toward its climax, Clara's voice soaring higher, carrying hope and desperation in equal measure, and not a single person watching could look away. The final note hung in the air like a prayer, perfect and heartbreaking. And as it faded, Clara opened her eyes. Tears streamed down her face in twin rivers, tracing paths through the dust and cold that marked her cheeks. But her voice had never wavered, not once, carrying its beauty through grief without faltering. The silence that followed felt sacred, as though the world itself held its breath. Then a single pair of hands came together, the sound of clapping breaking the spell. An elderly woman at the back stood, her eyes wet, and began to applaud. Others joined, hesitantly at first, then with growing fervor, until the entire terrace erupted in applause that rolled like thunder through the morning air. Thomas Bennett stood paralyzed, staring at Clara as though seeing a ghost made flesh. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. And when he finally found his voice, it emerged as barely more than a whisper. "You're Clara Whitmore." The name rippled through the crowd like electricity, heads turning, whispers spreading from table to table. People pulled out phones with urgent fingers, searching, typing, scrolling. Screens lit up with results. News articles appeared, headlines screaming from 2 years past. Child opera prodigy vanishes after father's death. Clara Whitmore missing, family in crisis. The voice that disappeared. Images loaded, showing a younger Clara in silk dresses, standing on grand stages, her smile radiant, her father beaming beside her. The patrons looked from their phones to the ragged child before them, the cognitive dissonance visible on their faces, shame creeping in like a tide. Thomas pressed his hand to his chest as memory flooded back with painful clarity. He had attended one of her concerts 3 years ago, had sat beside his wife Catherine in the third row of the Augustan concert hall, both of them weeping openly as this impossible child created beauty that seemed to channel something divine. Catherine had squeezed his hand during the standing ovation, her eyes shining despite the cancer that was slowly stealing her away. "Remember this," she had whispered. "Remember that beauty exists even when everything is dark." And now here stood that same child, transformed by tragedy into something he had not recognized, and the weight of that realization crushed him. The businessman who had threatened to call the police stood with his phone hanging uselessly in his hand. The couple who had mocked her coat looked at each other with horror at their own cruelty. The woman who had clutched her purse covered her mouth, tears spilling. Clara stood in the center of their attention, no longer invisible but suddenly, terribly visible. Her secret torn away, exposed and vulnerable like a wound open to air. She trembled, not from cold now but from the enormity of being seen. Thomas reached out his hand and Clara took it, her small fingers disappearing into his palm as he led her inside the café, where warmth enveloped them like an embrace. The interior glowed golden, all polished wood and soft lighting, the scent of coffee and fresh pastries filling air that felt impossibly luxurious after the bitter cold. He guided her to a corner table, away from the windows where curious faces still pressed against the glass, and returned moments later carrying a tray laden with hot chocolate in a ceramic mug, steam rising in delicate spirals, and pastries still warm from the oven, their flaky crusts dusted with sugar that caught the light. Clara stared at the food as though it might vanish if she blinked, her hands hovering above the mug, absorbing its heat. Thomas sat across from her, his expression gentle, patient, giving her time to eat before speaking. When she finally raised her eyes to his, he asked softly, "What happened, Clara?" And the story spilled out like water through a broken dam. The car accident on a rain-slicked highway 2 years ago. The truck that crossed the median. Her father dying in the hospital while holding her hand and whispering that she must take care of her mother. Margaret's collapse at the funeral. Grief manifesting as illness that never released its grip. Pneumonia and weakness that kept her bedridden. The mounting debts that consumed their savings like a fire. Medical bills arriving in endless waves. Insurance covering some but never enough. The performance contracts cancelled. The vocal academy refunding tuition to a family in crisis. Colleagues offering condolences but not help. No family to turn to. Her father's parents long dead. Her mother, an only child. Margaret's fierce pride preventing her from seeking charity, from asking the opera company or former patrons for assistance. Preferring starvation to the humiliation of begging. So Clara begged for them both, singing on street corners and subway platforms, her voice echoing in spaces that had no memory of her glory. But no one believed a child in rags could be who she claimed. Dismissing her as delusional or playing pretend. Tossing coins if they tossed anything at all. The weight of being her family's sole provider at 10 years old pressed down on her small shoulders, aging her in ways that had nothing to do with time. Thomas listened without interrupting, his eyes growing wet as the full scope of her suffering revealed itself, and in his chest bloomed both overwhelming sadness at what this child had endured, and profound admiration for the strength that kept her standing, kept her singing, kept her fighting for her mother's life with every breath she took. Thomas wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and leaned forward, his voice taking on the weight of someone sharing a truth he rarely spoke aloud. "I understand more than you know," he said quietly. "I was once a concert violinist, Clara. I had a promising career ahead of me. Orchestras asking me to tour, recordings scheduled, everything a musician dreams of within my reach." He paused, his gaze drifting to a photograph on the wall behind the counter, barely visible from where they sat, showing a younger version of himself holding a violin beside a beautiful woman with warm eyes. "But then my wife Catherine became ill. Cancer, aggressive and cruel. She needed care, constant attention, and the touring life became impossible. So I gave up performing and opened this café, something stable, something that let me be present for her final years." His voice cracked slightly. "She died 2 years ago. The same winter you lost your father." The parallel hung between them, 2 tragedies occurring in tandem, 2 lives shattered by the same season of loss. Thomas reached across the table and took Clara's hand again. "I understand sacrifice, Clara. I understand what it means to abandon the thing you love most because someone you love more needs you to survive. I understand the healing power of music and the devastating silence when you can no longer make it." He saw himself reflected in her determination and the stubborn refusal to break, despite circumstances that would have crushed most adults. She was him, years earlier, making impossible choices with grace he had barely managed. "Catherine and I attended your concert 3 years ago," he continued. "She was already sick, but she insisted on going. You sang Verdi that night, and she wept through the entire performance. On the drive home, she told me you reminded her why beauty matters, why we endure suffering, because moments of transcendence like your voice make existence bearable." The connection between them solidified, invisible threads weaving two broken people together, binding their shared understanding of stages abandoned and loves lost, and the stubborn persistence of hope despite everything. Thomas knew with absolute certainty what he must do. This child would not suffer alone anymore. He had been given a chance to transform his own grief into action, to honor Catherine's memory by saving the voice she had loved. "Clara," he said firmly, "I'm going to help you, not charity. Partnership. You will not face this alone anymore." Thomas leaned back in his chair, his mind already working through the details of a plan that had crystallized the moment Clara finished singing. "Here's what we're going to do," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had made his decision and would not be swayed. "You will perform here at my café every evening, not on the street, not begging, but as a proper artist in a proper venue. I'll set up a small stage in the corner, announce your performances, and you'll receive fair payment for your work. Dignified work, Clara. You'll earn every cent." He watched her face transform as hope flickered in her eyes, but he wasn't finished. "I still have contacts in the arts community, colleagues from my performing days, music critics, patrons who remember quality when they hear it. I'll spread word that Clara Whitmore has returned. Within days, this place will be filled with people who understand what they're hearing." Clara's lips parted, overwhelmed, but Thomas held up his hand. "But first, before anything else, we must help your mother. I'm calling a doctor today, right now, and I'm paying for whatever treatment she needs." The resistance came immediately, Clara's small body stiffening, her chin lifting in an expression Thomas recognized as pride wearing armor. "No, I can't accept that. I can't take your money. My mother would never allow it." Her voice carried the same fierce dignity her mother possessed, the stubborn insistence on suffering rather than accepting help. Thomas had expected this, had seen it coming like a wave he could not stop, but could perhaps redirect. He reached across the table and took both her hands in his touch gentle but firm. "Clara, listen to me. Your mother wouldn't want you suffering for her pride. She wouldn't want you standing in the cold, being mocked by strangers, singing for scraps while she lies ill. That's not pride. That's punishment. And neither of you deserve it." His voice softened. "Let me help. Let someone help. Your mother's pride comes from love, from not wanting to be a burden. But Clara, you're 10 years old. You should be learning and playing and growing, not carrying the weight of survival on your shoulders alone." Tears began to fall from Clara's eyes, not the controlled tears she had shed while singing, but the raw, unleashing sobs of someone whose defenses had finally crumbled. "Please," Thomas whispered, "let me do this. For Catherine, who loved your voice. For your father, who would want you safe. For you." Clara nodded through her tears, unable to speak, and Thomas felt something broken inside himself begin to heal. Hope, real hope, flickered between them for the first time in 2 years. Thomas's car wound through streets that grew progressively shabbier until they reached a building that seemed to lean into itself with exhaustion, paint peeling from its facade like old skin. He helped Clara from the passenger seat and followed her up 3 flights of narrow stairs that smelled of mildew and desperation, the hallway lights flickering weakly overhead. When Clara opened the door to their apartment, Thomas felt his breath catch in his throat. The space was barely larger than his café's storage room. Bare walls marked with rectangles where photographs once hung, a single blanket folded on a threadbare couch, cupboards standing open and empty like mouths frozen mid-scream. Margaret Whitmore lay on a narrow bed in the adjacent room, her gaunt face turning toward them as they entered, suspicion and weakness warring in her expression. "Clara, who is this?" she asked, her voice hoarse from coughing. "Mama, this is Thomas Bennett. He owns La Belle Époque café. He heard me sing. He knows who I am." Clara's voice trembled with desperation. "He wants to help us." Margaret tried to sit up, her body shaking with the effort, defiance blazing in eyes that had once been vibrant. "We don't need charity from strangers," she said, each word costing her strength. "We'll manage on our own." Clara dropped to her knees beside the bed, taking her mother's hand. "Mama, please. He heard me sing Puccini. He remembers my concert from before. He understands. Please. I can't watch you suffer anymore. Please." The naked desperation in her daughter's voice accomplished what pride could not withstand. Margaret's walls crumbled, tears spilling down her hollow cheeks as she looked from Clara to Thomas, seeing perhaps for the first time how much her stubborn independence had cost her child. Thomas approached slowly, respectfully, and knelt beside them both. "Mrs. Whitmore, I lost my wife 2 years ago. I understand what it means to need help and be too proud to ask for it. But your daughter has a gift that belongs to the world, and right now she's spending it on survival instead of art. Let me help you both, please." Something in his manner, the genuine respect in his voice, the absence of pity in his eyes, reached Margaret where Clara's pleas could not. She nodded weakly. Thomas immediately pulled out his phone and called a doctor friend, speaking in urgent tones while Margaret and Clara clung to each other. While they waited, Margaret spoke haltingly of their struggle, the hospital bills that had consumed every penny of their savings, the performance contracts cancelled not from cruelty but from the chaos of grief, the colleagues who had drifted away, leaving them isolated and forgotten. Thomas listened without judgment, seeing in Margaret's fierce love for her daughter a mirror of his own devotion to Catherine. Understanding that pride was sometimes just love wearing a different face, Dr. Sarah Chen arrived within the hour, her medical bag in hand, her expression transforming from professional neutrality to shock as she took in the apartment's conditions. She examined Margaret with gentle efficiency, her stethoscope moving across the weakened woman's chest, her fingers checking pulse points and lymph nodes, her questions delivered softly but probing deeply. When she finished, she turned to Thomas and Clara with a mixture of concern and relief. "Severe pneumonia, significant malnutrition, and complete exhaustion," she said quietly. "Her body has been fighting for too long with no resources to sustain the battle. But it's treatable. She needs antibiotics immediately, rest, proper nutrition, and time to heal." She paused, glancing at the bare cupboards. "The medication alone will be expensive, and she'll need follow-up care. Blood work? Possibly chest imaging." Thomas didn't hesitate, didn't even blink. "I'll cover everything," he said simply. "Whatever she needs, whatever it costs, send the bills to me." Margaret wept, her thin shoulders shaking, overwhelmed by kindness from a stranger that felt impossible and undeserved. Dr. Chen wrote prescriptions with swift, decisive strokes, her pen moving across the pad, while she gave instructions about dosages and timing and the importance of complete bed rest. She handed the papers to Clara, then paused, studying the child's face with growing recognition. "You're Clara Whitmore," she said softly. "I attended 3 of your performances years ago. You sang at a charity benefit for the children's hospital where I work. Your voice raised $50,000 that night, funded an entire wing renovation. You moved everyone to tears." Clara stared at her, stunned. She had not known, had never understood how far her voice had reached, how many lives it had touched beyond the applause that faded when curtains closed. "Doctor," Chen squeezed her shoulder, "your impact was wider than you knew. Take care of your mother. The world needs your voice again." She left with promises to return in 3 days, and Thomas immediately drove to the pharmacy, returning with bags full of medication, supplements, and groceries that filled the empty cupboards with abundance Clara had not seen in 2 years. Margaret took the first dose of antibiotics with water. Clara held to her lips, and within hours, something miraculous happened. Color returned to Margaret's cheeks. The rattle in her chest eased, and when she looked at her daughter, her eyes held clarity and hope, instead of the fog of suffering that had obscured them for so long. Thomas spent that evening on the phone, his voice animated as he called contacts he had not spoken to in years. Music journalists who remembered his performing days listened with growing excitement as he told them Clara Whitmore had been found alive, singing at his café. Former colleagues from orchestras and opera companies spread the word through their networks. Arts patrons, who had mourned the loss of her talent, shared the news with reverence and disbelief. Social media erupted like wildfire, her old fans posting and reposting the story of the child prodigy who had vanished into poverty and emerged singing for bread on a café terrace. Videos from that morning, captured on phones by patrons who had mocked her before recognizing her genius, went viral, accumulating millions of views as strangers watched a ragged child create impossible beauty. Within days, La Belle Époque transformed into a pilgrimage site for those who understood what they were witnessing. The café packed every evening, reservations booked weeks in advance, people traveling from across the city and beyond to hear the lost prodigy sing again. Thomas set up a small stage in the corner, simple but dignified, with proper lighting and a microphone that carried her voice to every corner of the space. Clara performed each night, her repertoire spanning classical arias and beautiful art songs, Puccini and Verdi and Mozart, pouring from her like water from a spring. Her voice had matured in the 2 years of suffering, deepened with a quality that transcended technical perfection and entered the realm of truth. She sang with the authority of someone who had walked through fire and emerged carrying embers in her hands. Each performance felt transcendent. Audiences sitting in stunned silence before erupting into applause that shook the windows. The money flowed in like a river breaking through a dam, tips left in amounts that made Clara's hands shake when she counted them, donations pressed into Thomas's hands by patrons who wanted to be part of her resurrection. Performance fees that Thomas insisted she receive in full. For the first time in 2 years, Clara could afford real food, fresh vegetables, and meat and bread, still warm from the bakery. She paid for her mother's medication without anxiety gnawing at her stomach. She even began paying off old debts, small amounts sent to the hospital, and the landlord, and the vocal academy, chipping away at the mountain that had buried them. Journalists requested interviews, their emails and phone calls flooding Thomas's café as news outlets competed for Clara's story. She faced cameras for the first time in years, sitting in a chair that felt too large for her small frame, lights harsh and bright, microphones capturing every word. But Clara spoke with the same quiet dignity she carried on stage, her voice steady as she recounted the accident, her father's death, her mother's illness, the 2 years of survival that had aged her beyond her years. She never complained, never expressed bitterness toward those who had dismissed her or the world that had forgotten her existence. Instead, she spoke only of gratitude, her mother's fierce love that had sustained her, Thomas's kindness that had changed everything, the second chance she never thought would come. The contrast between her humble demeanor and immense talent captivated audiences across the globe, viewers stunned by this child who possessed both extraordinary gifts. Videos of her singing went viral, shared millions of times across platforms. Her performance of that first morning on the café terrace, watched by people in every corner of the world. Comments flooded in by the thousands, expressions of shame at how society overlooks those in need, admiration for her resilience, offers of help from strangers moved by her story. People confessed to walking past homeless children without seeing them, to making assumptions based on appearance, to failing the vulnerable among them. Clara became a mirror reflecting humanity's failures and possibilities back to itself. A prominent music critic, Victoria Ashford, attended a performance 3 weeks after Clara's rediscovery, sitting anonymously in the back of the packed café. She wrote a review that appeared in the Times the following morning, her words carrying weight in circles that determined careers and legacies. Clara Whitmore hasn't just survived, she's transcended, Ashford wrote. Her voice carries the wisdom of suffering transformed into art. Where once she sang with the technical brilliance of a prodigy, she now sings with the emotional depth of someone who has lived a lifetime in 10 short years. Every note contains multitudes, every phrase speaks of loss and love and the stubborn insistence of beauty even in darkness. This is not merely a comeback, it is a revelation. We are witnessing the birth of one of the great voices of our generation, forged not in comfort but in fire. Important figures from Clara's past began appearing at the café like ghosts, stepping out of memory and into flesh. Maestro Giuseppe Ferretti arrived on a Wednesday evening, his silver hair still wild and uncombed in the way Clara remembered, his eyes searching the crowded room until they found her on stage. He stood frozen as she sang, tears streaming down his weathered face, and when she finished, he pushed through the crowd and swept her into his arms, sobbing against her small shoulder. "Bambina, Bambina, I thought you were lost forever." He wept in his thick Italian accent. He explained through his tears that he had tried to reach them after her father's death, had called and written letters that went unanswered because they had moved, had lost their phone, or had become untraceable in their descent into poverty. "I will train you again," he declared, gripping her shoulders. "Free of charge, every lesson, until your voice reaches its full glory. This I promise on my life." Then came Vivian Hartwell, director of the Metropolitan Opera House Youth Program, arriving in an elegant coat that whispered money and influence. She waited until the café emptied before approaching Clara with an offer delivered in crisp, businesslike tones that barely concealed her emotion. A full scholarship to the youth program, funding for all expenses, a return to formal training with the best instructors in the country, performance opportunities on one of the world's most prestigious stages. "We should never have let you slip through our fingers," Vivian said quietly. "That failure is ours, not yours. Let us correct it." Clara stood overwhelmed as opportunities she thought lost forever materialized before her eyes like miracles, the life she had mourned suddenly resurrecting itself, promising a future she had stopped allowing herself to imagine. But even as gratitude and hope swelled in her chest, her eyes found Thomas across the café, watching with a smile that did not quite hide the sadness beneath it. She moved to him, her small hand finding his. "I can't leave you," she whispered. "Not after everything you've done. You saved us. How can I just go?" Thomas's smile deepened, became more genuine, and he knelt down to her level the way he had that first morning. "Clara, you're not leaving me. You're becoming who you were always meant to be." That night, after the last patron departed and the café fell into the peaceful silence of empty chairs and dimmed lights, Thomas sat with Clara at the corner table where they had first shared her story. The city outside continued its restless movement. But within these walls, time seemed to slow, allowing space for words that needed saying. Clara's hands twisted in her lap, her face etched with conflict that pulled her in opposite directions. "I'm grateful to you," she began, her voice small. "You saved us when no one else would. This café has become safe, and I'm afraid to leave it. What if I fail? What if my mother needs me? What if I'm abandoning you after everything you've done?" Thomas reached across the table and took her hands, stilling their anxious movement, his grip warm and steady. "Clara, listen to me carefully. I didn't help you so you'd stay here forever. I helped you so you could return to where you belong. You're meant for grand stages, not my little café. Your gift belongs to the world. Not hidden in this corner where only a few hundred people can hear it." His eyes held hers with intensity that demanded she understand. "Do you know what Catherine said to me the night we heard you perform 3 years ago? She said your voice was proof that beauty exists even in darkness. She made me promise that if I ever had the chance to protect something beautiful, I would do it without hesitation. Helping you isn't charity, Clara. It's me keeping a promise to my wife. It's me finding purpose in grief." His voice cracked slightly but remained firm. "Your success will be my greatest joy, better than any repayment you could ever offer. Watching you return to those stages, knowing I played some small part in making that possible, that will heal something in me that's been broken since Catherine died." He squeezed her hands gently. "Be extraordinary, Clara. That's all I ask. Sing for everyone who can't. Carry your mother's strength and your father's pride, and my wife's belief in beauty. Take everything you've suffered and transform it into art that changes people. That's the only payment I want." The tears that fell from Clara's eyes were different now. Not grief or fear, but understanding. And she nodded. Finally, free to soar, Clara made her decision but knew she needed to do something special before leaving. Something that honored both where she had been and where Thomas had helped her arrive. She announced a final café performance, a benefit concert for families struggling the way hers had, all proceeds going to help others trapped in the cycle of poverty and illness that had nearly destroyed them. Thomas helped organize it with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything, spreading word through his networks, arranging for additional seating, preparing the café for what he knew would be an extraordinary night. When the evening arrived, La Belle Époque overflowed with humanity. Every seat filled. People standing, pressed against walls, crowds gathered outside on the sidewalk, listening through open windows despite the winter cold. Clara performed her most challenging pieces. Arias that demanded technical perfection and emotional surrender, her voice soaring through Verdi and Mozart and Puccini with a mastery that left audiences breathless. But the pinnacle came at the end, the moment she had kept secret from everyone except Thomas. She stood at the microphone and announced that her final song would be a duet arrangement of Massenet, and that Thomas Bennett would accompany her on violin for his first performance since his wife's death. The café fell silent as Thomas emerged from the back room carrying a violin case that looked ancient and sacred, his hands trembling as he opened it and lifted the instrument that had been silent for 2 years. He positioned himself beside Clara, raised the bow, and their eyes met in understanding that needed no words. The music began, her voice and his strings intertwining like 2 rivers joining into one, telling a story of loss and kindness and healing that transcended language. His violin wept and soared, her voice answered and embraced, and together they created something that was neither performance nor prayer, but somehow both. Every note carried the weight of grief transformed, of 2 wounded souls finding redemption through each other, of beauty rising from ashes. Not a dry eye remained in the café, strangers weeping openly, holding each other, feeling their own losses acknowledged and honored in the music flowing around them. The connection between mentor and student, between 2 people who had saved each other, was palpable and profound. And when the final note faded into silence, no one moved, no one breathed. Everyone held suspended in the sacred space that great art creates. The benefit concert raised over $30,000, money that arrived in cash and checks and online donations from people moved by Clara's story and determined to prevent others from suffering as she had. Clara used every penny to establish a fund for struggling families caught between illness and poverty, naming it the James Whitmore and Catherine Bennett Memorial Fund, honoring both her father and the woman whose memory had inspired Thomas to save her. She accepted the Metropolitan Opera Scholarship with gratitude that felt too large for words, knowing this opportunity represented not just her future, but the hopes of everyone who had helped resurrect it. Margaret's health continued improving week by week, color returning to her cheeks, strength flowing back into limbs that had been weak for too long. And together they moved to a modest but comfortable apartment 3 blocks from the Opera House, a space with actual rooms and full cupboards and windows that let in light without also letting in cold. Clara began formal training again under Maestro Ferretti's demanding guidance. Her voice pushed and stretched and refined, but she had changed in ways that made her a different artist than the prodigy who had disappeared 2 years earlier. Humility and empathy now flavored her artistry. Suffering had taught her things technique alone could never convey, and when she sang of longing or loss or hope, audiences heard truth instead of imitation. She visited Thomas weekly without fail, sitting at their corner table sharing stories over hot chocolate, and occasionally she performed at his café, not for money now but for love, her voice filling the space that had become sacred to them both. Their bond remained strong, transcending the categories of mentor and student or savior and saved, existing instead in that rare territory where 2 souls recognize each other across the distances that separate most humans. The press followed her comeback journey with fascination, documenting her return to formal training, her first recital at the Opera House, the standing ovations that greeted every performance. But Clara remained grounded, never forgetting the terrace where she had stood in rags asking to sing for bread, never forgetting the man who had looked past her poverty and seen her worth. 6 months later, the Metropolitan Opera House blazed with light, its grand facade welcoming the crowd that gathered for Clara Whitmore's official return performance, a youth production where she would sing the lead role in a specially adapted version of La Bohème. The audience filing into the velvet seats included Margaret, now healthy and radiant, her face glowing with pride as she clutched Thomas's arm. Doctor. Sarah Chen sat beside them. Maestro Ferretti occupied a box seat where he could observe every technical detail. And scattered throughout the orchestra section sat dozens of people who had heard Clara sing at the café, who had witnessed her resurrection firsthand. In the back rows, barely visible in the shadows, sat the patrons who had once mocked her on that frozen terrace, their faces carrying shame that no amount of expensive clothing could disguise. The lights dimmed, and Clara emerged onto the stage in a beautiful costume of burgundy and gold. Looking like the child prodigy the world remembered, but carrying something deeper in her bearing, something earned through suffering. Before the music began, she stepped forward and spoke, her voice clear and strong, reaching every corner of the magnificent space. I dedicate this performance to everyone who showed me kindness when I had nothing, especially Thomas Bennett, who saw my worth when others saw only rags, and to my mother, whose strength taught me survival. To my father's memory, who gave me this gift, and to everyone still struggling in darkness, remember that your dignity matters. Never stop singing. Then she began, and her voice filled the opera house with such beauty that the air itself seemed to shimmer. She sang of love and loss, of hope and despair, of the stubborn persistence of the human spirit, and every note carried the authority of someone who had lived the story she told. The performance was triumphant, technically flawless, but more importantly, emotionally transcendent, her voice weaving through the orchestra like light through darkness. When the final note faded, silence held for one eternal moment before the audience erupted in a standing ovation that shook the chandeliers. Tears streaming down faces of strangers and loved ones alike, everyone present understanding they had witnessed something rare and precious. Redemption made manifest. A girl who had sung for bread now sang for the world, and the world wept with gratitude. Clara Whitmore's story reminds us of a truth we often forget in our rush through busy lives: that worth is never determined by appearance or circumstance, that the person we dismiss might carry gifts beyond our imagination. A child in rags possessed immeasurable talent, but more than that, she possessed dignity that suffering could not destroy. And it took only one person seeing past the surface to change everything. Thomas Bennett's simple act of kindness, listening when others dismissed, saying yes when the world said no, changed not just 2 lives, but touched thousands who heard Clara's story and remembered their own capacity for compassion. Clara went on to become one of her generation's finest sopranos, her voice gracing the greatest stages across the world. But she never forgot the terrace where she stood asking to sing for bread, never forgot the man who saw her worth when she had nothing. She continued her charity work throughout her career, the fund she established, helping hundreds of families escape the trap of poverty and illness. Every year on the anniversary of that frozen December morning, she performed at La Belle Époque, filling Thomas's café with music that reminded everyone present why kindness matters. Thomas's café became famous, people traveling from everywhere to sit where miracles had happened. But he remained humble, always reserving one table for those who could not pay, asking only that they share their story, believing that everyone deserves to be heard. The moral echoes across time and circumstance. Everyone you meet is carrying a story, a struggle, a hidden brilliance that you cannot see unless you choose to look. Kindness costs nothing, but changes everything. One moment of compassion, one decision to listen instead of dismiss, can redirect an entire life's trajectory, can save what seems lost, can resurrect what appeared dead. Never judge by appearances, because the worn coat might hide a voice that moves nations. Always listen, because the quiet plea might contain your purpose. Sometimes the beggar at your door is an opera singer, and your kindness might be the note that completes their symphony. Share this story. Be someone's Thomas. Listen when others dismiss. Look deeper when the world looks away. Remember that we are all one act of kindness away from changing a life, and that life might be yours. Because grace flows both ways, and sometimes saving someone else is how we save ourselves.